Okay, this, of course, Facebook has to suddenly change their formatting. So hopefully, okay, yeah, I see people are joining. I'm just going to hang out for a second because Facebook, I don't know, they changed their formatting and it was giving me all kinds of trouble. Um, so give me 1 second. Just want to make sure this is working. Yeah, send me a couple messages, C3 people, and let me know that it's good to go. All right. I got to figure out a way to get this on my own page. I apologize. I mean, this is like, this is the way it goes. All right. Dang it. All right. Finally, I'm ready to go. 7 minutes later. Okay, if you're just joining us, welcome to my live C3 video. Okay, coming to you this morning, slow to get going. Facebook changed all their formatting, and of course, I think everyone and every organization and spiritual organization or church or I don't know, person with random thoughts is suddenly using Facebook Live and Instagram Live, and it's kind of strange, actually. What a strange time we live in, and of course, right in the middle of that, there's there's a sense of hey, we should change the formatting. So um, I'm doing a series at C3, and I'm calling it What Really Matters. I'm calling it that because that's what I've been thinking about. There's something about this particular time. Maybe you know the difference in Greek between kairos and chronos. Kairos is the the fullness of time is one translation. It's sort of like uh, when everything comes together might be the right way to say it. And chronos is chronological time. And chronological time is just this, especially in Greek, is just this relentless, unstoppable train coming at you. And kairos are the moments that appear in, uh, it feels more like an era or an age or a sudden invitation that's larger, I think, than who we think we are, that kind of thing, or than our chronological movements in time. And it feels like a kairos moment, the fullness of time. In some ways, it seems like this moment is saying time's up for how we've been living with this sort of paper thin modern life where we live paycheck to paycheck, and whenever we want um, food and toilet paper um, coming from all parts of the world is at our fingertips. And kairos is the moment in time when something deep is called forth. And I think we're in that kind of place. And so today I want to talk about what really matters. And the subtitle is fasting. That's what I want to talk about today. What really matters? I want to talk about fasting, and um, and I'll tell you why in a few minutes. Let me do some housekeeping details for the C3 community. Please do your best to share this Facebook Live with your friends. You can repost it on your own Facebook page. You can put it in an email. You can put the link in an email to some of your friends who maybe don't have Facebook. They can actually watch the link even if they don't have it. So that's just important to keep in mind. If you're a regular part of C3, you know that 80% of our donations come on a weekly basis. So if you're able to continue to give during this difficult time, you can do that. You can go to our website. There should be a link on the Facebook page now for donations. So anything is greatly appreciated. Of course, we have some reduced expenses and we have some ongoing expenses. One of the things that we want to continue to do is have a guest musician, and that's what we're gonna. As soon as I'm done with this, I'm going to repost Matt Gabriel's live session, music session that he did last night. He has an infant, so he couldn't do it in the morning. I think you'll really enjoy it, and we want to support our musicians who are suddenly almost completely out of work when it comes to live shows and live performances for obvious reasons. So anything you can do to support us would be good. 10 a.m. Sunday, followed by the teaching. Monday mornings, we'll try to post a kids-oriented teaching, and Wednesdays we have our weekly meditation. If you're new to C3, that is just someone in the community, a voice in a community, giving a short 3 to 5 minute reflection. It's a part of our weekly service that we have all come to really appreciate and enjoy. So you can join us Wednesdays at noon for that. If you want additional stuff, I also have my own podcast. I usually don't talk about it at C3, but I have my own podcast, Hints and Guesses. You can find it on my website, kentdobson.com. I simply couldn't remember, kentdobson.com. Yes, that's my website. You can find a link to my my podcast. I'm going to continue to make more. I might just continue with the idea of what really matters on my own personal podcast, because I have a lot of things sort of stirring that I think, or I hope will at least be helpful in that respect. So one final thing, if you're part of C3, read the newsletter. We have a fantastic newsletter. It is the absolute best way to stay connected. And also, if you have any concerns or needs, we have an amazing community concerns, community care team. And if you need help, please let us know. If you're the kind of person who can offer help, especially in the Grand Haven, Tri-Cities, Grand Rapids, West Michigan area, please read the newsletter, sign up for the newsletter. You can do so on the website. It's really one of the best things we have going in terms of communication. So that's it. That's it for details. So yeah, I want to talk about today what really matters. I want to talk about fasting. And first, let me just say maybe a few things that are on the personal side about how I'm feeling. I don't know what's going on for you, but I feel like the kind of adrenaline of the first couple weeks of this is wearing off. And it was sort of like, what are we going to do? Where's this thing going? Checking my pantry, checking my bank account, the sort of, okay, how are we going to get through this? That kind of adrenaline, which is a major motivator, especially in times of crisis, kind of the fight, flight, freeze, instinctual self, which I talked a bit about last week, kicks in, survival mode, survival dance, and that's extremely important. But that kind of adrenaline is sort of worn off for me, and I don't know, I'm starting to feel like, yeah, actually, how long is this going to last? And there's a kind of a settling down in a way, and it feels strange. And the sense of the unknown it's like the horizon is extending out further. I think at the beginning I would have said, yeah, no one knows how long this is going to last, but now I guess I'm feeling it in a specific way now. Um, and I think there's a shift. I guess I'm feeling a shift for what can I do right now to a kind of acceptance that I don't know if I call it acceptance. That might be exaggerating. A kind of invitation to um, I don't know, holding the unknown. And maybe it's not so much a matter of what can I do and how can I overcome, but I don't know, an invitation to look out on the horizon and hold a certain amount of I simply don't know. No one knows. Because the sort of ripple effect of the crisis that we're in, we just don't know how far out the rings in the pond are going to extend. And that, yes, that brings anxiety, but it also brings that great unknown liminal space of transformation. One of the things we know from myths and stories and legends and sacred texts is that the liminal not knowing space is the place of transformation. And it's a universal. And crises, like I said last week, or conflict or collision, as Jung calls it, is a great invitation to do some self-examination and to let the unknown do its work. And I'm not saying that's easy. I can feel it dawning. The other thing that I think I said last week that I don't know, I feel like is a consistent, healthy pressure that I feel right now is to do what I'm now calling a searching spiritual inventory. Of course, I'm borrowing from the 12 Steppers, searching moral inventory, and that's certainly part of it, but a searching spiritual inventory, like, and I mean it sort of in the way, how am I living? How have I been living? And what illusions have I been living under? And what are things that I know, I really know I can do and ought to do and am not? That's kind of what I mean by searching spiritual inventory. Really, what are my values? What are the values that I say out loud, but don't actually have any intention of living out in any concrete way? That's what I mean by a searching spiritual inventory. And I think that's my challenge on one level to the C3 people and to other people who are listening. What would it look like to do a kind of searching spiritual inventory right now? Health and food. I made a list of things. Health, food, what I've been eating and where does it come from? I don't know about you, but I'm starting to gain the COVID-19 pounds. I don't know what it is. It's like, oh no, I need sugar. I need bread. My daughter works at a little cafe in Ada, Michigan, and the owner of the cafe has a hard time getting flour right now because there's like a run on flour. She's like, only, the last few years I've made great effort to meet everybody's gluten-free preferences and gluten-free allergies, and now suddenly I can't even find flour because people are just buying flour in bulk and baking bread. So maybe it's just because maybe it's kind of a sort of comfort food thing. Anyway, health and food, how I've been spending my time, how I spend my time. Suddenly my sense of time is disrupted. Travel, most of my life is connected to travel. And I have been, my own retreats and programs in Israel and other places, suddenly they just evaporate. So what is my relationship with travel? And that phrase, non-essential travel, it's kind of troubling, really. And some searching spiritual inventory just along the lines of family. What is family? And what is it like to stay connected to family and loved ones? And actually, what is my concrete relationship with my own family right now? Because sort of my ordinary friendships, the ordinary patterns of how I spend my time, especially with friends, is totally disrupted. So anyway, I don't need to go on and on. You do your own searching spiritual inventory. That's my challenge. So I started thinking about fasting because I started thinking about how we're being asked to pull back and retreat and distance and isolate and withdraw. These are all like um, the these are the invitations of the present age we're in, but they're also part of the deeper stream of this massive spiritual practice and tradition that's rooted in fasting, which is about isolation and distance and withdrawal and limiting and emptying oneself, limiting oneself from the ordinary food and hang-ups and um, and retreating in a way. Maybe that's another word for it, just to retreat. I mean, retreat has that kind of dual image of, you know, you retreat like in warfare or conflict, or like in Monty Python, run away, run away. And but then there's like this I don't know, deeper dimension that's something like to do a searching spiritual inventory, to step out of the ordinary patterns of life and to withdraw and to go inward. Maybe that's a better way of saying it. And we live in a highly extroverted culture. I mean, when you go to a party, people ask you, what do you do? That's an extroverted culture that says, I know myself by what I do. I know myself by things I make. I know myself by the job and the role that I inhabit in society. And suddenly you can't say that. Or the invitation is to say, who are you without these roles, I guess? Without this external persona-oriented way of being in the world, suddenly we're asked to go inward. Who am I now? What happens if I come home and come home to myself? Who is the one coming home? That's within the realm and in the great tradition of fasting, which is transcultural and transreligious. You find it in almost every single spiritual practice or spiritual kind of community or religion in the entire globe, as far as I'm concerned. And of course, I'm not like a comparative religion expert, but I spent a fair amount of time in these waters, at least. So in ancient cultures, they had a certain way of making this withdrawal, retreat, fasting, separation sacred. They called it sacred. It was part of initiation ceremonies, rites of passage, where at certain points in life, you were invited to cut yourself off from, you could even say, your external role, and to go inward and to see what's there. And in all of its horror and all of its glory, both. Because as soon as you go into your cave, that's the way the desert fathers and mothers called it, go into the cave, go into the desert. As soon as you withdraw, you see that who am I is more complicated. And there's a whole village down there vying for my attention. And fancy words are subpersonalities and complexes and things like that. But there's a whole village down there that wants to have a say that has been operating without consulting me, so to speak. So I want to say that, first of all, a time of withdrawing, and I'll say more about fasting specifically in a minute, but a time of retreating and drawing back is sacred, and it's sacred time. And the wisdom traditions, in all their wisdom, have called it sacred. And I think there's something of that in the wind right now, because there is a panicked, stressed, freaked out way of withdrawing. And then there's the deeper dimension, the sacred invitation that I think might be calling us or drawing us into what it has to offer. So I was reading some Jung this week. I bring up Carl Jung a lot because I guess I consider him now to be one of my teachers among many. And I'm not like a Jungian expert. I haven't, done in-depth Jungian analysis or anything like that. I'm more of a fan, and I find the way he weaves in myth, stories, legend, religious stuff, science, mathematics, just like it just rings my bell for some reason. But anyway, I was reading some Jung this week, And he said that one of the things that he started noticing in Europe is that sophisticated urban people were often more neurotic than rural people. And this is why he said this, because in the industrialized West, and in our urbanized environment, you leave your place of residence and you go somewhere else to work. And with that, you get to generate and create, consciously and unconsciously, a kind of work persona. Like, who am I out there in the working world? And he said what happens is that you can over-identify with that working self in an urban environment which is completely cut off from your home life, and you come back home and you are a completely different person. He says this is an exaggerated kind of split that happens. And he was saying this, I can't remember when the essay, I think it was somewhere in the 1950s or something like that, or maybe 40s earlier, that he wrote this. And now I think we can exaggerate that by tenfold, that much of life, work is somewhere else, and it's almost completely cut off. I mean, Robert Bly, I don't know if you've ever read Iron John, but Robert Bly says it used to be the case where he's speaking to young men, but that young men used to watch their own father's work. And there was a certain kind of wisdom to that that's nonverbal. And it's seeing your father in and I think we can extend this. I know Robert Bly's writing to men in this book, but just father or mother, we can extend that. But now that image of somewhere to work is completely cut off and isolated and over there somewhere. It's our public persona, we could say. And then we come back home and sometimes we're completely different people, and exaggerates the split. And of course, wholeness, growth is about integration and the drawing of those two things back together in some respect. He says, in a funny way, rural people don't seem to have as much of a problem because there's less of a split. It's more of a whole society. I also work at home, and the village or the town is interconnected, and they see me in a variety of settings and I see them in a variety of settings, and the whole environment is a little more whole. At least that's what he says. Why am I saying all that? Is because right now we live in an age where that split is exaggerated. And there's something about fasting, retreating, returning, withdrawing, that is about separating in a way from that public persona and doing a bit of the inner examination, the searching spiritual inventory, the who am I when I'm not producing, making my public persona. Persona means mask. I probably should have mentioned that a few minutes ago. Persona is mask. That's the Latin word for mask. We put it on, and sometimes we do that consciously. Sometimes we don't. I don't know if I'm like this big time. Like if I lived in Israel for a few years, and sometimes when I'm talking to my Israeli friends, I kind of talk like I have an accent. And sometimes I catch myself doing it, and sometimes I don't. That's a mask. That's like I put this thing on, I have no idea. Like, do I think my Israeli friends are going to understand me more if I have a slight accent in English? No, of course not. They speak English. So that's just an example of I'm out in public and I slide this thing on. And I want to say there's nothing wrong with personas. It's part of how we present ourselves to the world. It's part of how we come to know ourselves, and others come to know us out there. Now, it's only a mask. And retreating, withdrawing, fasting is about taking that off in some respects. It's about the vulnerability of taking that off. It's about and feeling a bit of that solitude. Like I just thought of Rilke's line, go out into your heart as onto a vast plain. Go out into your heart as onto a vast plain. Like the inner journey is the vast plain. Go out into your heart as onto a vast plain. And there the immense loneliness begins. And again, in an extroverted culture, we want to avoid aloneness at all costs. Isolation, we avoid at all costs. Isolation, aloneness equals a kind of cultural or psycho-spiritual death to the Western product-oriented, consumer-oriented culture. So what have I said so far? That withdrawing is sacred. And right now, collectively, by no choice of our own, we're being asked in a kairos sense, a fullness of time sense, to come back home. And here are things from the wisdom tradition, in case you're forgetting, in case you think fasting is, well, I don't know what you think about the word fasting, but let me just mention some things. Of course, the first person that comes to my mind is Jesus. Before he really entered the world to carry what is his to carry publicly, he went into his heart as unto a vast plain. And there the immense loneliness began. That we call the 40 days and 40 nights in the wilderness. That is isolation, that's separation, and that's an act of the act itself is sacred. And it even says in the scriptures, which I think is very interesting, the Spirit, the wind of God, led Jesus out into the wilderness where he was tempted. That's such an interesting phrase. It's almost like the divine mystery led Jesus away from crowds and culture and persona and name and who am I and what can I do, to the vast solitude of the wilderness itself. And there you get to find out what you're made of, which is why he's tempted. It's like you all of a sudden are into the labyrinth of your own hang-ups, your own addictions, your own addictions to power and to safety and security and name and whatever. I don't know your addictions, but that's what Jesus is facing by being tempted by Satan, so to speak, the accuser. The temptation to be spectacular and powerful and a kind of a miracle worker. That's sort of the temptations that Jesus is dealing with in the wilderness. So he's one example. And also from the biblical story, you have Elijah, who goes 40 days and 40 nights into the wilderness without eating, searching, in this case, for God. And eventually he hears what is very hard to translate from Hebrew to English, but a still small voice, a whisper, the sound of sheer silence in the emptiness of the desert. Moses also, by the way, spends 40 days and 40 nights on Mount Sinai, I assume without eating. And one of the best lines in the Bible, that it says, the people are like, whatever happened to that fellow Moses who led us out of the wilderness? So that he's like, he's gone. And again, what is he doing up there? What are these figures, these characters doing? Or think of Buddha, who sits under the Bodhi tree. One of my favorite images of the Buddha, and I think Joseph Campbell is the one that first sort of turned me on to this, is Buddha sitting in the lotus position underneath the tree, and he has one finger on the ground. And that image is what retreat, isolation, and fasting is about. Emptying oneself and finding a kind of ground that is outside our public persona, touching the earth. Here Buddha is sitting on the earth itself, one finger touching, the other in a kind of posture of emptiness, waiting to receive. That's the great invitation of fasting. And in of course, the Lakota tradition and other indigenous tribes from Native America, also from Australia, they have their own version. And in Africa, as far as we know, they have different versions. Africa is like wild in terms of the different kinds of people groups, but they maintain very similar kinds of traditions that young people, in order to grow up, went out, isolated themselves to touch that ground like Buddha does, a deeper ground of their own existence. And that required an emptying, a fasting, a limiting oneself from ordinary food, from ordinary life, from ordinary persona, just to grow up. And somehow we think we're beyond this. Somehow we think getting a driver's license at 16 will do it. That'll help us grow up. Or being able to vote at 18, or buy cigarettes, or drink at 21, or whatever. I think they start to fizzle out after that. Maybe marriage is a kind of public rite of passage. But that's not at all rooted in the kind of ancient wisdom sort of tradition. So, one other thing I should mention from the Christian tradition is Lent itself. Lent, 40 days and 40 nights, imitates Jesus' emptying himself, traditionally has an element of fasting. I know people give up chocolate, but that was about saying, in some respects, facing your own addictions and saying, no, I want to empty myself. And we're in that time period right now by no choice of our own. None of us got up and said before Lent, hey, it would be great if the entire culture went on a kind of Lenten journey. No, none of us thought that, unless there's some prophet out there that I don't know about. But that's what's happening to us right now. We are collectively being asked to isolate, to pull back, and to do some self-examination, because that's what Lent was about. Waiting, emptying, a searching inventory, even being tempted, I think. Tempted to maintain our addictions. Maybe one of the best things we could do right now during this Lent-like season is give up our addictions. And by the way, Facebook and your newsfeed is pumping out ways to keep it up. Like, here are 75 things you can binge on Netflix. Keep up your addictions. Don't go inward, in other words. Don't fast. So anyway, that's what I think this cultural moment is inviting us to. And in isolation, fasting, and separateness in the sacred sense, it's there that we can hear the soul speak, the deeper self speak, or even the divine speak. The mystery of existence begins to whisper things that our panicked, anxious personas don't know anything about, are running from in a way. So here's a little passage from David White, and then I'll try to wrap this up here. So I've been really into this book lately, Consolations, the solace, nourishment, and underlying meaning of everyday words. And I was reading this week the entry called Withdrawal. So I'll just read you a couple little lines. He says, "We stick to the wrong thing quite often, not because it will come to fruition by further effort, but because we cannot let go of the way we have decided to tell the story. And we become further enmeshed even by trying to make sense of what entraps us, when what is needed is a simple, clean breaking away. We stick to the wrong thing quite often, and the story of that thing quite often." Another way of phrasing it, Brene Brown says, what is the story that I'm making up? What is the story that I'm sticking to? What is the story that I must maintain at all costs? That is a question of persona, of mask, and over-identifying with the story. You can hear that, by the way, creeping up in spiritualish circles. I'm an extrovert. I'm an introvert. I'm a 4 on the Enneagram. I'm a 3 on the Enneagram. I'm an INTJ. And I'm not saying these don't have value. They do have value. They actually have some value in beginning some self-examination. But the story, we often stick to it when sometimes what is needed is a clean break. That's what he says. Saying, no, I don't know anymore. Then he says this, to remove ourselves entirely and absolutely, abruptly, and at times uncompromisingly is often the real and radical, courageous break for freedom. This is a sacred no, in other words. Unsticking ourselves from the mythical tar baby, seemingly set up just for us right in the middle of our path, we start the process of losing our false enemies and even our false friends, and most especially the false sense of self we have manufactured to live with them. We make ourselves available for the simple purification of seeing ourselves and our world more elementally and therefore more clearly again. We withdraw not to disappear, but to find another ground from which to see. This is the Buddha touching the earth. We withdraw, not to disappear, but to find another ground from which to see, a solid ground from which to step, and from which to speak again in a different way, a clear, rested, embodied voice. Our life as a suddenly emphatic statement, and one from which we do not wish to withdraw. In simple words, he's saying, sometimes you need a no. You need a sense of isolation. You need to cut yourself off from the way you've been living and being to find that more sacred ground in order to return to the community with a truer sense of meaning, purpose, voice, something like that. And I think we're in that time. So finally, just some questions. What do you want to fast from? Does part of you want to take this time even more seriously? That's the question. And what do you need to fast from? News? Food? Addictive substances? I saw that in Michigan that marijuana sales were skyrocketing. And again, I'm not against the use of weed, but part of that is stay numb. Stay numb. I imagine alcohol sales are the same. Stay numb. So what might we need to fast from? News, sports. I guess we have no. I have to say I was a little disappointed when the English Premier League said we're not going to play anymore. I was like, what? What am I going to do? At least I could distract myself with soccer, and I like how they're playing old games now. Fasting from non-essential relationships. That's not exactly heartwarming. That can hurt a bit. Fasting from the masks that you ordinarily wear, like the one you wear at work if you go to work, travel for work. Fasting from our digital input, and I know this is totally ironic because here I am speaking into a camera on Facebook Live and on a Sunday morning, and I'm using my Instagram too. But part of me knows, yeah, I need to fast from digital input. And at what point do the numbers start to just make us go numb? At what point do we begin to tune out? Well, tuning out is one thing. Intentionally saying no is quite another. That's the more sacred path. So these are questions. I mean, of course, I don't want to give you too much more, but just the simple question of what do I need to fast from? And what do I need to go into? Because it's not just I'm going to cut off things. That's one thing, but it's an invitation to go into something deeper, like a searching spiritual inventory, which all of a sudden you realize I'm not as righteous as I thought. I'm not as enlightened as I thought. I'm not as moral as I thought. I might be more concerned about my own safety and survival than my friends, neighbors, relatives, and people on the other side of the world. You get to see, I'm not as clean as I thought. That's the desert. That's what the desert. But going into that, into the labyrinth of who we are, is a great invitation. So searching moral inventory, a kind of emptying, a kind of listening, a fasting from ordinary things so that I can listen more deeply to the wind, to the bird song, to the rain, to the coming spring, which comes anyway, like Mary Oliver says, meanwhile the world goes on. Tell me about your despair and I will tell you mine, she says. Meanwhile the world goes on. Tell me about your despair and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile the world goes on, calling to us. So those are my main questions today. What really matters, I think, of a word like fasting. fasting from certain things and moving into others. So I don't know, like everything that I do in terms of teaching and writing, I hope you find something I said helpful, and something, some small invitation, something catches your peripheral vision, or you hear a faint whisper of something. I hope you find something that was said today that is helpful. And most of all, I want to say here at the end, stay safe, stay smart, and be courageous. Be of heart in the old French sense of the word courage. Be of heart. Stay smart, stay safe, and be courageous. And I hope to see you back here 10 a.m. next week, and I'll continue on. So, peace, my friends.